obsession, passion for him burns like fire.
Our seventh session on the return of Jesus. Today's session is on the role of Israel as we look at the return of Jesus. You can write me at jeff@toknowjesusmore.com if you have questions. You can also go to our website, toknowjesusmore.com, and post your questions on our forum, download the notes, etc. Israel is God's prophetic clock when it comes to the end times. The things that we see happening in Israel and concerning Israel are key indicators to us of what is happening. Now, there are 4 key signs to be watching for regarding Israel. The first is the rebirth of a nation. We must understand that this was unimaginable. We read this in Isaiah 66:8. Who has heard such a thing? Who has seen such things? Can a land be born in one day? Can a nation be brought forth all at once? As soon as Zion travailed, she also brought forth her sons. Isaiah was speaking of the day when Israel would become a nation again. Zechariah 12:6, the prophet Zechariah said, "In that day the inhabitants of Jerusalem again will dwell on their own sites in Jerusalem." This is in the context of the return of Jesus. This is in the context in the end of the age. What's so unimaginable about this? Well, after almost 2,000 years, Israel became a nation. The people of Israel were allowed back into their land, and they came under the name of Israel. In 70 AD, when Rome destroyed the temple, enslaved the Israelites, many of them were killed by the sword, millions of them, and they were driven out of the land. The Roman emperor had become so fed up with the Jews and their constant resistance, constant fighting against him, that he finally sent his army in to destroy it. They were scattered throughout the world, and until 1948, they had no homeland. They moved from country to country. They had small groups that were moving throughout Europe, into Africa, India, different places. But in 1948, on one day, Israel became a nation again. Another significant event following that was in 1967, Israel actually took full control of Jerusalem. They had not had control of Jerusalem since 70 AD. Now, the Lord said that they would return to Israel. In the returning to Israel, there's a term in the Hebrew that's called aliyah. And the Lord said that they would return to the land. And in 1948, when they became a nation, people started coming back to the land of Israel. And in the 1990s, after the Soviet Union imploded, since that time, over 1.3 million Russian Jews have returned to Israel. This is unprecedented in the history of the world. There's not been such a return of any people to a country that had ceased to exist and is now a country today. Consider the significance of this prophecy, and you will understand what we're looking at. Today, there are now 6 million Jews in the land of Israel, whereas before there was a few hundred, maybe 1,000 before 1948. And it's happening before our eyes. They are still returning. There's still things happening. It's not unusual to hear a news item that some group of Jews was discovered in some part of the world, India perhaps, and they've been returned. In Jeremiah 16:14, we read this: "Therefore, behold, days are coming, declares the Lord, when it will no longer be said, as the Lord lives who brought up the sons of Israel out of the land of Egypt, but as the Lord lives who brought the sons of Israel from the land of the north and from all the countries where he banished them. For I will restore them to their own land, which I gave to their fathers. Jeremiah was prophesying about the return of the Jews to the land from all the nations of the world after the destruction of Jerusalem. Now some might say that this was after the destruction by Babylon, but the Jewish people didn't return in the numbers that we're seeing today. The second return after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, this prophecy is speaking of this at a much grander level. Now, the second sign that we can be watching for is Hebrew culture. And there's many parts of the Hebrew culture that we're actually seeing being restored today. First of all, the temple must exist. The temple does not exist today. There's the Temple Mount, and on the Temple Mount there's an Islamic shrine called the Dome of the Rock. And many people feel that dome must be destroyed and removed before the temple could be rebuilt. An alternate possibility is that alongside the Dome of the Rock there's actually a location where they believe the temple might have been set. Now, regardless, either way, it will take a significant miracle, a significant negotiation, so to speak, for the temple to be built. And it doesn't exist today. So that's a sign that we're looking for, we're watching for. But the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, and if you visit Jerusalem, you can actually see the huge stonework of the temple that's been pushed off the Temple Mount onto the sidewalks and areas below the Temple Mount. It was great effort to totally level the temple and clear off that mount of anything to do with the temple. It will be rebuilt. And along with the temple, then the priesthood needs to be restored. And it's very interesting that with the restoration of the priesthood, we're actually seeing a number of these things coming into place today. There are some who believe that the temple is actually prefabricated and sitting in a warehouse, waiting to be put up. I heard this when I listened to Josh McDowell, who had just returned from the Holy Land back in about 1980, and he said that he was told that the temple was already ready to go. Along with the priesthood, we need to see the restoration of the sacrificial system. Now today there is running a school to train the priests on how to function in the temple, and this includes how to properly do the sacrifices. You don't just cut an animal and cut it up and throw it on the altar. There's a special process, there's a proper way to do things, all these things that need to be done. And this school is now open and running. And the high priestly garments are already ready-made. There was a church from the Philippines that actually brought gold to the leaders in Jerusalem so that they could make the gold crown that we read about in the Old Testament that was worn by the high priest. There are multiple different articles that are already prepared: bowls, the tongs, dishes, the snuffers, all those kinds of things. So this stuff is all happening today. It's happening in our generation right now as we live. These things are getting ready and prepared so that when the temple is rebuilt, they're ready to go. They don't have to do all this work. The priests will be trained, the articles will be ready, the furniture will be ready. And that brings up one particular piece of furniture, and that is the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant is a great mystery today. There are some who believe that it's actually hidden underneath the Temple Mount in some chamber. We know that the Muslims are actively digging around underneath the Temple Mount, and they're destroying much of what they find. There are also archaeologists who are doing digging under the Temple Mount. We don't know where the Ark of the Covenant is today. If it exists, it might have been destroyed. Now, the Ethiopian church, there's a monastery in Ethiopia that claims to have it. Nobody's allowed in to see it, of course, but the Ark of the Covenant will be an important piece of furniture for the temple when it's rebuilt. So that's one of the things we can be looking for. When I was there in 2004, I was told of an archaeologist who was walking by a construction site. And there was this big, wall that they were doing construction in front of, and there was an opening in this wall, and he stuck his flashlight in there, and what he saw was something made of gold with blood that had been dried blood that was over it. Now, the location of this particular site was directly below Golgotha. And so the story was told that the Ark of the Covenant was actually hidden there before the Romans came. And that when Jesus died, that he was actually crucified directly above the Ark. And the dried blood that would on the mercy seat of the Ark was representative of Jesus' blood. Rumors abound in Israel. It's hard to know what's true, what's not. But the Ark of the Covenant, we believe, will be restored in some way, whether they build a new one or whether the original is found. And when the temple is built, it will be brought back. One of the things about the sacrificial system is there needs to be a red heifer. We read about this in the Old Testament, that the red heifer and the ashes of the red heifer sacrifice were used to consecrate certain articles in the temple. Well, there hasn't been a red heifer in Israel for centuries, until recently. There was a red heifer born within the last decade or so, and now they've started learning how to breed the red heifer. The red heifer is an anomaly. It's kind of like an albino that is born. Now, when the sacrificial system is restored, we need to understand that there is no salvation through sacrifice. Jesus was the final sacrifice. There are teachings that the Jewish people have their own way of salvation to God, and that's through the sacrificial system and through their righteous acts and righteous works. But this is simply not true. Jesus was the final sacrifice. Paul tells us multiple times that over and over again, it is only through Jesus, faith in Jesus, that anyone is saved. And that includes the Jewish people. We need to be wise. There's many Gentile believers who get excited about the Hebrew culture, and they have this desire to be Jewish. And there's a lot of excitement around this today, but we need to be wise in how we approach this. The Jewish people are God's people. They're the brothers and sisters of Jesus in the flesh. And so they're very important to him, without a doubt. But people sometimes respond positively to the Jewish culture, to the Jewish people, in a way that's not necessarily wise. There's been much money given to Israel from churches around the world. And this money is handed directly over to the Orthodox, the ultra-Orthodox groups. And it's a show of support, which is good, but understand that oftentimes these monies are actually used to persecute the Messianic Jews in the land. So you want to know who you're giving it to, who you're supporting. We do want to support the needy. We want to support those who, the Holocaust victims and things like that. But we need to be careful that we aren't giving money that's turned around and used to actually persecute our brothers and sisters. The thing about the temple being built, there's an excitement about it, but we need to understand there's a bittersweetness about it as well. Because this temple that will be rebuilt will eventually be desecrated by the Antichrist, which will usher in 3.5 years of extreme cruelty upon the Jewish people. until the time of Jesus returns. So it's something we look forward to, but with a tempered excitement, knowing that Jesus is coming. He will make all things right. But in the between time, it's going to be a very difficult time for the Jewish people. Another part of the Hebrew culture is the legal system. The legal system is both civil and religious. And there's things like the Sabbath being restored in 1951. It became illegal for businesses to be open and different things to happen on the Sabbath. Now there are businesses that do run on the Sabbath, but those are usually non-believing Jews who non-religious Jews, and the Arabs. Jesus talks about in Matthew 24:15, therefore when you see the abomination of desolation, then let those who are in Judah flee to the mountains, and pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath. Because Jesus is telling us right here that the Sabbath laws will be in place at this time. So this is an important legal thing that had to be reestablished, and it is today. Another important part of the Hebrew culture is the Hebrew language. When you look at the history of Israel and understand that for over 2,000 years, the people were not living in the land of Israel, they were scattered throughout the world. After 2,000 years, when they came back, they were able to reestablish the Hebrew language as their national language. That's really incredible. It's unprecedented. There is no nation, no people group who lost their homeland after one generation was able to maintain their original national language. Typically, they're absorbed into wherever they were at, and they took on the language of the local people. But Israel was able to reestablish after 2,000 years the Hebrew language. Many see this as a part of Zephaniah's prophecy. For then I will restore to the people a pure language, that they may call on the name of the Yahweh to serve him with one accord. It might be stretching a little bit, but that's one possible interpretation of this passage. Another very important part of the Hebrew culture is their military. Since day one, the Israeli army has been a wonder around the world. There are so many things that they have accomplished, so many things that they have overcome, that they should have lost, that they should have been defeated multiple times. And yet God was with them, and as they were able to protect their nation. In Zechariah 10:5-6, we read this: they will be as mighty men, treading down the enemy in the mire of the streets in battle. And they will fight, for the Lord will be with them. And the riders on horses will be put to shame. And I will strengthen the house of Judah, and I will save the house of Joseph, and I will bring them back, because I have had compassion on them. And they will be as though I had not rejected them, for I am the Lord their God, and I will answer them. There are many stories of how the Israeli army experienced God's intervention. In 1948, when they first became a country, the Arab nations around them surrounded them, were intent on driving them into the sea. And yet, their inexperienced army overcame and defeated and drove off the Arab armies around them. There was a story, sworn testimony by an Egyptian soldier. He and his brigade had entered the Sinai Peninsula on their way up into Israel. And there was a single Israeli tank in their way. They didn't see the tank, but this Israeli tank was there, and they knew that they were facing a larger group. There was a battalion of Egyptian army ahead of them. And they decided they would just turn their engine on and they would move into place and do what they could to slow down the onslaught. Well, when they did that, on the Egyptian side, what they heard was thousands of tanks, not just one. God used the echoing of the hills and valleys to amplify the sound of that one tank into the sound of thousands. And it caused that Egyptian battalion to turn around and return to Egypt without firing a shot. Those kinds of stories are not uncommon. God has been with the Israeli army. Now, the Israeli army is not perfect. They've made mistakes. And they've been struggling in the last decade or so with their reputation. But they are still a military force that God uses and will use to protect Israel until the time when he withdraws his hand and the Antichrist is actually able to crush the Israeli army. The third key sign is the salvation of Israel. Now, Paul writes in Romans 11:26-27, he says, "And so all Israel will be saved, just as it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion. He will remove ungodliness from Jacob. This is my covenant with them when I take their sins away." Now, the ultimate fulfillment of this will be when Jesus returns to Jerusalem and Israeli leaders and the people of Israel recognize him for who he is. But up until that time, there's a trend that we're watching, and that is more and more Jewish people are recognizing Jesus as their Messiah. Unfortunately, there are obstacles before the Jewish people in recognizing who Jesus is. And the biggest obstacle today is the church. The history of how the church has treated the Jews is horrible. The church has failed Israel in so many ways. Every Jewish child, boy and girl, when they're going through their bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah, learn 4 things that they are taught to remember that were done to them in the name of Jesus. The first is the Crusades. When the Crusades left from Europe and were moving towards the Holy Land, when they came upon the Jewish people, often those Jewish people were slaughtered without mercy. The Spanish Inquisition. When the Spanish Inquisition came to Spain, the Jewish people were forced either to convert, to flee and leave Spain, or to be tortured and suffer and die. There are still shackles hanging on the outside of some buildings in Spain that were used at that time to torture the Jewish people. And the Jewish people have not forgotten this. It was a horrendous time of treating the Jews horribly because they were the ones who crucified Christ. The third persecution of the Jews that they are taught to remember are the pogroms that happened in Russia and Ukraine under the Orthodox Church. Oftentimes the Orthodox Church would instigate the villagers to rise up and go through the Jewish areas and destroy things and burn homes and disrupt things, kill animals. So oftentimes just at a moment's notice forcing them to sell their places at a price that is almost nothing and leave the village and have to move on to a different place to reestablish their home. This was not an uncommon occurrence. If you're familiar with the story of the Fiddler on the Roof, this is an example of that kind of story. The fourth example, the fourth time that they're taught not to forget, is Hitler's Holocaust. Now we may look at that and say, well, that wasn't the church. That was the madman Hitler who who was demonized and hated the Jews. But do you know that Hitler used the writings of Martin Luther to stir the church up against the Jews and silence them against defending them? When Martin Luther was older, he wrote a pamphlet. And in this pamphlet, he wrote that the Jewish people should be killed, they should be driven out of the country. And it was a horrible thing that he wrote. It confuses many people who study Luther's life, because he started off early with compassion for the Jews, wanting them to see who Jesus, the Jewish man, really was. But Hitler found this pamphlet, and he used it to silence the church's opposition to what he was doing to the Jewish people. And the church, for the most part, did not resist the persecution of the Jews during that time. Now, there were some important people like Dietrich Bonhoeffer who resisted, and others, Corrie ten Boom and families like her that would hide the Jews. But for the most part, the Christian culture in Germany was silent, and some even participated in the persecution, the Holocaust of the Jews. Part of the reason is much of the church at that time was embracing something called replacement theology, which we'll talk about shortly. There are stories that a church that had its building next to the railroad tracks was in the middle of a service, and a train was coming by slowly with full of Jewish people on their way to the concentration camps. And the cries and the suffering was so loud that it was disrupting the service. And so instead of stopping and doing anything, even praying for them, they simply turned their organ louder and sang louder so they could not hear the cries of the Jewish people. That grieves my heart to think about that. But the church has been the biggest obstacle to the Jewish people finding Jesus as their Messiah. It's the church's greatest failure. Now today, a Jewish person does not convert to become a Christian. A Jewish person acknowledges and recognizes his faith that Jesus is their Messiah. They don't need to convert. They just need to repent and acknowledge who he is. And so the Jewish people today often use the term messianic believer. And so that it's a great affront to Jewish families when someone converts to be a Christian. It's like dying to their family. But if they take on the term messianic Jewish believer, it's a little easier, but there are still many difficulties for Jewish people within their culture when they put their faith in Jesus as their Messiah. Now, this is a miracle that's happening today, and it's a miracle that's reflecting this fourth sign. And so we're watching this closely because we're seeing this as a trend that's increasing. In 1972, in the land of Israel, there were less than 200 Messianic believers, and there were only 2 churches. Today, there are over 120 Messianic congregations, and there's over 20,000 Messianic believers in Israel alone. This is a sign and a wonder. The fourth key sign is that Israel would be a center of controversy. Now, the Hebrew prophets foretold that Jerusalem would be persecuted in all the nations, and that the nations would come around Jerusalem. In Zechariah 12, we read this: "Behold, I'm going to make Jerusalem a cup that causes reeling to all the peoples around. And when the siege is against Jerusalem, it will also be against Judah. It will come about in that day that I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone for all the peoples, and all who lift it will be severely injured. And all the nations of the earth will be gathered against it. We're actually seeing a gathering of the nations against Israel today. There's large segments of the church that actually are standing against Israel. They don't recognize Israel today as being of any importance. They've taken on the same spirit as the Arabs in many ways, the Muslims in many ways. There was this thing called replacement theology. It's a teaching that arose from Constantine back around 400 AD, that the church had actually replaced Israel, that Israel had lost its favor with God, had been cut off from the promises of God because of what they had done to Jesus, and that the church had stepped in and was the recipient of all the promises that God had promised to Israel. It's interesting to note that the curses and the consequences of not obeying were not also included in that. Those were only left for Israel, whereas only the promises were given to the church. This is a very bad teaching in many ways. It causes the church, people who follow this teaching, to not honor what God has promised to Israel, to usurp so much of what God has said was for Israel. You know, Paul talked about in Romans that we are grafted in. They were cut off, but they can be regrafted because of the natural branches. We're the wild branches, and we were grafted in by the mercy of God. And if they repent, they can be naturally grafted back in easily compared to us. And so we need to be praying for Israel. But Israel is the center of controversy. The UN recently drafted a resolution that essentially denied any connection of Israel to a temple on the Temple Mount. Now, this is a blatant lie that the Muslims have been preaching for a long time now. They flatly deny that Solomon's temple was ever on that Temple Mount. They claim it was built somewhere else in Israel. And now the UN has passed resolutions affirming that fact. Of course, it doesn't help that many of the Muslim nations are in positions of having a voice in the UN against Israel. There's something called the Boycott Israel movement. This is a movement that has been spreading, that attempts to influence universities and governments and individuals from investing in any way in Israel, from refusing to purchase any product from Israel, to damage their economy as much as possible. Black Lives Matter embraces this boycott Israel movement. There are accusations of apartheid akin to what happened in South Africa. Apartheid in South Africa was the division between the whites and the blacks, where the whites had all the rights and privileges and the blacks had no rights, had very few rights and privileges. It was a totally different environment, totally different culture. Israel is blamed for denying the Palestinians and the Arabs these same kind of rights and privileges. And yet if you go to Israel today, there are many Arabs who have full citizenship, full rights to vote, participate in government, to have their businesses. They are not treated any differently than the Jewish citizens. There are many Palestinians who come from the West Bank that will come into Israel for the better paying jobs and be treated much better. Now, of course, there's individuals who do not treat Palestinians or Arabs well. That's going to be in every culture where people treat other people differently. But as a government, as a whole, Israel is not an apartheid state. but it's one of the accusations that is constantly heard against them. And many churches, as a result, refuse to support Israel in any way or acknowledge that she has any place in God's plan. It's very interesting, very saddening. In 2018 in the UN, there were 27 resolutions condemning a country's behavior. Of those 27, 21 were against Israel. Does that make any sense? Countries like China, like Korea, like many of the Islamic countries who are terrible on civil rights, none of them got these resolutions against them. They were all focused on Israel, except for 8 of them. This is an example. This is a picture of Israel being the center of controversy, and this is one of the signposts that we keep our eye on, because it's predicted, it's prophesied, and we're seeing it happen. Now, there are groups within the church who are believers who support Israel blindly, and that's not what I'm suggesting. We need to be wise. Israel's not perfect. The people in their military are not perfect. They make mistakes. They make poor judgments. They can do wrong things. So that's not what I'm saying at all. But there's an abundance of lies and hatred against Israel today, and you need to be very discerning about what you're listening to, what you're hearing, and check the facts. Not on Facebook, of course, but do your own research and see and listen to the voices of believers, messianic believers in Israel, and listen to what they're reporting on these events to get an idea of some of the truth behind them. You know, Jesus expects his bride to stand with Israel. But this does not mean we endorse or condone evil. This controversy that's going to rise and is arising is going to cause a persecution to arise throughout the world of Israel. And in the last 3.5 years, the Antichrist will take it to an incredibly horrific level. But it's going to cause the Jewish people to want to flee back from the nations around the world that they currently are living in. In Jeremiah 16, the prophet says, "As the Lord lives, who brought up the sons of Israel from the land of the north and from all the countries where he had banished them," God is saying, "I will restore them to their old land, which I gave to their fathers." Now, as the Jewish people are living in the nations of the world, they still look at Israel as their homeland. But many of them choose not to live there at this time, partly because of comfort, partly because of economy, partly, there's many different reasons. There's large populations in the United States, still large populations in Europe, Ukraine. Ukraine has the largest Messianic congregation in the world. And there are many wealthy Jews who have homes both in Israel and in Europe or other places. But they are planning, they all have a plan of escape out of these nations where they live to get back to Israel. They know it's coming. They expect it to come. They feel it happening, and they feel the tension around them sometimes. And they make these plans not if it's going to happen, but when it's going to happen, so they can escape to Israel, where they will feel like they have a relatively safe place to be. But God tells us about something in Jeremiah 16. He says, "Behold, I'm going to send for many fishermen, declares the Lord, and they will fish for them." There's 2 ways that God is going to bring the people back to Israel. That's his intent, that's his plan, that's his heart. And the first is by fishermen. What do fishermen do? Fishermen gather and bring into the boat. And so the fishermen that are sent out are those who will gather the Jewish people, and it'll be a friendly approach. And there are actually many ministries today that are helping Jewish people return to Israel and make aliyah, as they call it. And so these are a friendly way. This is a comfortable way, so to speak. It's a gentle way to bring the people of Israel back to Jerusalem from the nations that they're living in. But that same verse continues, and afterwards I will send for many hunters, and they will hunt them from every mountain and every hill and from every cleft of the rock. Now this is going to be the persecution. This is going to be the hard way to get back to Israel. But there'll be many people who don't want to return to Israel for whatever their reasons. And after God has given them the friendly approach, then he will send out the hunters. And the hunters are those who will persecute them and drive them out of their nations back to Israel. Now, the return to Israel is going to be very interesting because when I was there in 2004, I was standing on a mountain overlooking the valley of Megiddo, also known as Armageddon. And I was told that I was looking at the largest landing strip in the world, that under the soil, Israel had built a huge, huge landing strip with the purpose that it would be used to welcome in the planes that are flying from the nations of the world with refugees coming from Europe, coming from Ukraine, coming from America even, coming from other nations where the hunters have begun functioning and are driving the people out. And they are anticipating a huge refugee airlift from the nations of the world. And the Valley of Megiddo is a place where they have prepared for just that purpose. So there's 4 key signs that we need to be aware of on God's prophetic time clock. And they all deal with Israel. The rebirth of the nation in 1948, taking Jerusalem in 1967, the Hebrew culture being reestablished with the laws, the priesthood, the temple, and all those kinds of things, the salvation of Israel, the increase of the Messianic Jewish believers that are happening around the world and in particular within the state of Israel itself, and Israel becoming the center of controversy around the world. Now, as we talk about Israel, we want to understand the heart of it, Jesus for Israel. In Matthew 23, Jesus laments over Israel, and he says this, "To gather your children, but you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I say to you, the leaders of Israel, you will see me no more until you say, Blessed is he who comes in the name of Yahweh. Behold, your house is being left to you desolate." He's mourning over what he knows is coming, but he's also prophesying that they will welcome him back. The history of Israel has brought great pain to the heart of Jesus. It had to happen because of their hearts. Between 600 and 550 BC, Babylon invaded and destroyed the temple in Jerusalem and enslaved the people of Israel, bringing them into Babylonian captivity. 70 years later, a group of Jews came and started to rebuild the temple. And then in 70 AD, the temple was destroyed again by the Romans, and 99.9% of the Jews were exiled, many of them into slavery. Do you think Jesus was weeping over his people in this time? 1948, they came back as a nation, both politically and religiously. 1967, they retook Jerusalem in a miracle. When Jesus returns, the Antichrist will be fighting against him for the throne in Jerusalem. He will defeat the Antichrist, but he will not enter Jerusalem before he's invited in. There's in Matthew 23 that I just read is actually what some consider to be a divine loophole. The devil looks at that, he says he knows he's defeated, but if he can destroy all the Jewish people so that there's no one left to welcome him in, Jesus can't return. It's an interesting thought. Now, Jesus has great zeal for Jerusalem. One of the things that he's looking forward to is that it's going to be the seat of his government. His throne will actually literally be in Jerusalem during the millennial time. We see this in Jeremiah 3:17. At that time they will call Jerusalem the throne of Yahweh, and the nations will be gathered to it, to Jerusalem, for the name of Yahweh. Nor will they walk any more after the stubbornness of their evil heart. Jesus will be ruling from Jerusalem during the millennium. This is where he will be governing, he'll be issuing orders. This is where he will be, and this is where his heart will be. It's interesting to look at it, but Jerusalem is actually the geographical center of the world. If you take all the continents and bring them all back together from where they were separated, Jerusalem is in the dead center of that mass. And Jesus will be ruling from the center of the world. He's got great passion for Israel. We read this in the prophet Isaiah. Look down from heaven and see from your holy and glorious habitation. The prophet's asking, where are your zeal and your mighty deeds? The stirrings of your heart and your compassions are restrained towards me. And we read in Isaiah 42 that Jesus is restraining himself. And then when it's time for him to return, the Father says it's time to go. The nations have been singing for him, singing their love song around the world. And the Father says, okay, now you can go, son. We read in Isaiah 42 where it says, I have been restraining myself, but no longer. Like a woman in labor, I will cry out. The passion will go out as Jesus comes from heaven and begins to deal with evil and wickedness on the earth. As he confronts the Antichrist and his armies, he's doing it with passion over Israel, over his people, over his bride. But Israel is included in the target of his passion. In Zechariah 1, we read this. And Yahweh answered the angel who was speaking with me with gracious words, comforting words. So the angel who was speaking to me said, proclaim, saying, thus says Yahweh of the armies, I am exceedingly jealous for Jerusalem and Zion. There was a jealousy, a godly zeal within the heart of Jesus over Jerusalem. Hosea 2:14, therefore, behold, I will allure her. I will bring her into the wilderness and speak kindly to her, speaking of Israel. The heart of Jesus is so towards his people. He has not rejected them. He has not cut them off forever. We know that Paul talks about for a short time, but all Israel will be saved. Hosea 2:16, it will come about in that day, declares Yahweh, that you will call me Ishi and no longer Bali. Those two words, that you will call me husband and no longer master. There is a tenderness in that. It's a longing that Jesus has in his heart for Israel. Now, it's a very important test for the church. It's very important how we view Israel. We want to be aligned with his heart for Israel. And unfortunately, there are many in the church, many church organizations, whole denominations, who totally refuse to acknowledge Israel as having any importance in God's eyes. And this will be a litmus test for the church, a litmus test of obedience. And in Isaiah 62, we see this. This is Jesus speaking. For Zion's sake, I will not keep silent. For Jerusalem's sake, I will not keep quiet until her righteousness goes forth like brightness and her salvation like a torch that is burning. This is Jesus interceding for the people of Israel, okay? He says, I will not keep silent. And then in the same chapter, he says this, on your walls, O Jerusalem, I have appointed watchmen. All day and all night they will never keep silent. You who remind Yahweh, take no rest for yourselves, and give him no rest until he establishes and makes Jerusalem a praise in the earth. Jesus is calling watchmen who will stand on the figurative walls of Jerusalem. The watchmen would stand on the walls and look out, watching for the army, the approaching armies, or the approaching dignitaries, or whoever was coming. And it was their job to let the people know what was happening. Let the king know what was happening. Well, in a spiritual sense, this is a figurative thing that Jesus is saying here. He says that he's appointed watchmen on the walls of Jerusalem, and they are to be interceding night and day before the Father on behalf of Israel. So who are these watchmen? I believe it's the church. The church is called to be the watchman of Israel, to intercede for her. And in order to intercede, we have to gain the heart of Jesus for Israel. And so it's a very important thing that the church get this heart, the same heart of Jesus for the people of Israel, and not reject him, not turn them away, not do things that would cause them to reject him. Are you a watchman today? Have you taken your place on that wall to intercede for Israel, to learn the heart of Jesus? Jesus has such great love for Israel. In Luke 19:14, says he approached the city and he saw the city and wept. This is Jesus' heart. He weeps over the people of Israel today, those who do not know him, the many who will reject him unto eternity, who will be lost forever. But his heart of compassion is for them all. And if this is Jesus' heart, what must be our heart? Romans 11, Paul says this, quite right, they were broken off for their unbelief, and you stand by your faith. But do not be conceited, but fear. For if God did not spare the natural branches, he will not spare you either. Behold then the kindness and the severity of God. To those who fell, severity, but to you, God's kindness, if you continue in his kindness. Otherwise, you also will be cut off. It's the kindness of Jesus that allowed us to be grafted in. The severity of God in dealing with the rejection and the hard-heartedness of the people of Israel caused them to be cut off. But they're not cut off forever. If they repent, they will likewise be regrafted in, just like you and me. The scripture calls us to stand with the plans of God for Israel. Will you agree with what God is wanting to do for Israel? Isaiah 40, verse 1, comfort, O comfort my people, says your God. Speak kindly to Jerusalem. Call out to her that her warfare has ended, that her iniquity has been removed, and that she has received of Yahweh's hands double for all her sins. That's the heart of God over the people of Israel. Speak kindly to them. So how do we stand? How do we do this? How do we stand with Israel? In Jeremiah 31:7 it says, thus says the Lord, sing with gladness for Jacob, and shout among the chief of the nations. Proclaim, give praise, and say, O Lord, save your people, the remnant of Israel. We stand with them, number one, by interceding for them, praying for their salvation, doing it daily, doing it night and day. As often as God brings it to your mind, as you seek his face, as you seek the face of Jesus, seek his heart for the people of Israel as well. That's the end of this session. Thank you for joining me, and we'll see you at the next session on the millennium.